When was the last time you told yourself the truth? Not to someone else, not in a conversation. To yourself, alone, in the silence. I don't mean a small truth. I mean the one you already know. The one that has been sitting with you, quietly, for years. The one that's there when you wake up, still there when you turn off the light. That one. There is a kind of lie that doesn't feel like a lie when you tell it. It feels like patience, like wisdom, like being realistic about your circumstances. It sounds like this. Next year I'll make the change. When the kids are older, when the mortgage is paid, when I have more energy, when the moment is right. The moment never comes, but the sentence does. Every year it comes back, slightly adjusted, still convincing, still yours. And the strangest thing, it's not that you believe it. Part of you knows perfectly well that it isn't true, and yet you say it, and yet it works. Because the alternative, telling yourself the truth, has a cost you're not ready to pay. There was a man, 53 years old, an engineer, 22 years at the same company. He didn't hate it. That's what made it so hard. It wasn't a bad life. It was something worse. A life that gave him just enough to have no clear reason to leave. A decent salary, some stability, colleagues he could have coffee with without it being an effort. But there was something without a precise name, a feeling, very old by now, that he was living a reduced version of himself. Not a bad version, just reduced. As if he had made a decision years ago without realizing it was a decision, and had been justifying it ever since. At 38, he'd had an idea, a project of his own, something that used to keep him awake at night, in the good way. The kind of sleeplessness that doesn't exhaust you, that makes you feel alive. He'd written everything down in a notebook, the plan, the name. The notebook was still in the drawer of his bedside table, 15 years later, unopened. He hadn't given up. He'd never made that decision either. He'd simply kept postponing. First the car loan, then his daughter's birth, then the kitchen renovation, then the crisis, then the next crisis. There was always something, always a completely legitimate reason to wait a little longer. And every reason was true. That's what made it so hard to see. Every single reason was completely real. But the sum of all those true reasons had built something that wasn't true. A life that looked, from the outside, exactly right. One evening his daughter, 21, studying away from home, visiting that weekend, looked at him across the dinner table and said something he didn't expect. "Dad, are you happy?" She didn't say it with cruelty, not as a reproach. She said it the way young people do when they still believe direct questions are possible, with that unfiltered honesty adults lose so quickly. And the man opened his mouth and said yes, before he could think, before he could stop himself. 22 years of telling everyone he was fine. The reflex didn't need permission anymore. But this time, he heard it. He heard it in a way he never had before. And his daughter looked at him. And he knew, in that moment, that she had heard it too. That night he didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from something stranger, because the drawer was there, and the notebook was there. And for the first time in 15 years, he couldn't convince himself he'd think about it tomorrow. There is an old law, one of the oldest. You shall not give false testimony. Most people read it as a rule about courtrooms, about protecting the innocent from being destroyed by what someone says about them in public. But there is a courtroom that comes before all the others, the one where you are the only witness, and the only judge, and the only one who knows what actually happened. That testimony, the one you give yourself in private about your own life, is where everything else either begins or stops. The night they arrested Jesus, they brought in witnesses, men who had agreed beforehand on what to say. Their job was simple: provide testimony that would justify what had already been decided. But the text says something unexpected. Their testimonies didn't agree. Even among themselves, the stories kept shifting. A detail here, a contradiction there. The lie couldn't hold its own shape. And then there was Peter, standing outside in the cold, near a fire, while inside, the verdict had already been reached. A servant girl looked at him and said, "You were with him." And Peter said, "No." A second person, "You are one of them." And Peter said, "No." A third time, "No." Peter wasn't a traitor in the way we imagine. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't woken up that morning intending to deny anyone. He was a man who, under pressure he hadn't anticipated, chose, in 3 consecutive moments, the version of himself that could survive that night. And he chose it so fast, it barely felt like a choice. And then a rooster crowed, and Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Not because he'd been caught, not because he feared the consequences, but because he had heard himself 3 times, and the distance between who he was and what he had just said was, suddenly, finally, too large to ignore. The man with the notebook didn't resign the next morning. That's not how these things work. But something shifted that night, something that had been comfortable in the dark, well-fed, perfectly justified, became visible. And once something is visible, you can't choose not to see it. You can only choose what to do with it. The commandment doesn't ask you to be brave all at once. It doesn't ask you to throw everything overboard. It doesn't ask you to have all the answers tonight. It asks you to be an honest witness to your own life. To not say the old thing automatically before you can stop yourself when someone asks, or when you ask, in the silence, walking alone. That's enough to start with. What is the sentence you've been telling yourself for 1 year or 5 or 10 that you already know isn't true? You don't have to answer out loud, but you do have to answer.